A philosopher once noted that something is odd if you are not liberal when you are young and conservative when you are old. These are the words of Madiba in Long Walk to Freedom. I must admit that I do not know who the philosopher was, but Madiba said it, so it must be true. And I do think that there is a DNA in there is a fire in the DNA of young people. And as I reflected on being asked to speak here today, I thought that while I don't have the kind of years of experience that many of the people in the room may have, what I do have within me is this fiery DNA. And perhaps it gives me insight into the world in a new and different way, and a new and different way that can perhaps add something valuable to the discussion on land reform. And at the very least, I thought, because society can sometimes be forgiving towards young people when they are blunt and honest, at the very least, I would unashamedly exploit the social advantage afforded to me on account of my age and be as blunt and honest as possible. Some on Twitter might call that hashtag youth privilege. Over the past few years, I'm glad a few people in the room got it. I can see who's on Twitter and who isn't. Over the past few years, the foundation was involved in a multi-stakeholder convening called the Mandela Initiative. And the aim of the initiative, it really had a two-pronged approach of dialogue and research, and the aim was to investigate key strategies to overcome South Africa's development challenges. And when the initiative came to an end, the foundation wanted to continue some of that work and embrace two focus areas to do that. So one is early childhood development, and the other is land. And those are the two portfolios that I work in at the foundation. Initially, we had done quite a lot of work in the rural land space, but upon reflection, realized that there was a need to focus more on the urban space, especially where we are located in Gauteng, and have subsequently directed a lot of our efforts towards that sphere of work. What has underpinned all the work that we have done to date across both portfolios is the commitment to prioritize and elevate the voices of grassroots organizations. We strongly believe in people's ability to speak for themselves, and that the very people whose lives are affected by policy must be included in the discussions about such policy. While this seemed to us to be quite a simplistic and straightforward approach, because we often found that it wasn't the norm, it almost seemed as if we were doing something unique and special. In light of this, when I engage with the notion of urban citizenship, I cannot help but be preoccupied with the who. If urban citizenship is a verb, there's obviously individuals and individuals behind this actioning and behind this striving. So who are we talking about? Who do we expect to be the individuals behind this actioning? And how do we understand these individuals? And much of my contribution here today will center around these dimensions. In his collection of essays published in 1903, in The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a African-American sociologist, author, and activist, writes about the notion about double consciousness, which is relevant for us today when we engage with the notion of who. Double consciousness describes a state of being in which a person's identity is divided into separate parts, such that it inhibits them from having a unified identity. Du Bois felt that Black people in America had a duality of identity, because on the one hand, they were American, but on the other hand, they were Black, and these identities couldn't be reconciled. In The Souls of Black Folk, he writes, "It is a peculiar sensation, the sense of double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. This internal conflict of identity that he speaks of is relevant to our discussion here today. I was recently at a gathering in which a young black woman said that for black people living in informal settlements and townships, it is as if they are living in the diaspora because they are so removed from land, so removed from South Africa. And I really want to say this again so we are able to absorb it. For black people living in informal settlements and townships, it is as if they are living in the diaspora because they are so removed from land, so removed from South Africa. While I don't know this young woman, I reflected on the sense of double consciousness that she must feel. On the one hand, she is a South African, called on to support the project of post-apartheid South Africa. But on the other hand, she's a young black woman who feels that she is not at home in the land of her birth. So I imagine that she too must find it difficult to house these identities, to come to terms with these two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings that Du Bois spoke of. So when we talk about the notion of urban citizenship, and this being as a responsibility and a duty to the urban collective, what burden of responsibility are we placing on people who already have to endure this sense of double consciousness? What is our reaction when people are paralyzed into inaction owing to this double consciousness? How do we react to people who do not give into this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, such that they act in ways that we do not approve? Are we upset as society that they do not care what we think? I think the reality is that we rely on black people in South Africa to have a sense of double consciousness. We need them to leave a part of themselves at home as they navigate between private and public spaces, because our stability as a middle class depends on it. We fear the narrative that says supporting the post-apartheid South African project is to the betrayal of one's experiences as a black person. That is why for some it becomes upsetting when people question the legacy of Madiba, because they fear that in this questioning is a call for more radical and fundamental change in society. So when we are in our quiet spaces, reflecting on the notion of urban citizenship, we need to think about what our expectations are of the who, and what has shaped these expectations. At the foundation, we have increasingly been in discussions where people question the revolutionary credentials of Madiba. As a society, in our zeal to make the project of post-apartheid South Africa work, we have contributed to a distortion of who Madiba was, such that he's seen now as a cuddly old man who danced at concerts, as if that was his primary identity. And we must be careful to not allow this distorted image that we have of Madiba to shape our expectations of how other citizens ought to behave and interact in society. In 1991, Madiba spoke of how the South African state was based on the conquest and dispossession of the indigenous peoples of their land and its wealth, and how this disposition itself has been institutionalized and formalized into law. Many years later, he spoke of how landlessness, among other things, were reminders that the mission of meaningful freedom, democracy, and human rights is yet to be fulfilled. Madiba made assumptions about his role and about the role of the people that would come after him. He saw his role as being that of reconstruction and reconciliation, and he thought he was setting the basis for the next stage of the revolution. This, for instance, is demonstrated in a speech that he gave at the 50th the 50th National Conference of the ANC in 1997, in which he says, "The time has come to hand over the baton. The time has come to take leave. The time has come to hand over the baton in a rally that started more than 87 years ago in Mangaung. And so the time has come to make way for a new generation." So Madiba really saw himself as taking us up to a certain point and expected the generation and the people that came after him to continue that race and to take forward that baton. So how do we take forward this baton? How does the academy and as NGOs, we take up that baton in a way that moves us forward leaps and bounds? I'm sure these are the kinds of questions that occupy the minds of everyone in this room. When engaging with the notion of who, one of the things that I've become increasingly uncomfortable with is that how we as NGOs and academics are comfortable with speaking on behalf of people and assuming the primary role of the who. This is the kind of constant self-reflection that I think the Isandla Institute new 5-year strategic plan really calls on us to do. Earlier in the year, I was at one of the consultations for the expert advisory panel on land, who just recently submitted their report to the president. And there were private stakeholders present, like property association and banks. There were 2 NGOs, and there weren't any grassroots organizations present. And in the group I was in, one of the things that we had to discuss was what is one of the pressing policy interventions that we would implement with immediate effect. And the group, to my mind, didn't seem to understand the urgency of the issue, which is reflected in their suggestion of a bold intervention that should be implemented with immediate effect, being that of piloting. There were also recommendations that were offered with great authority. For instance, that all that needed to happen was that people living in informal settlements just needed to be given title deeds, and all would be well. This suggestion was, of course, blind to the fact that this would merely serve to reinforce the spatial legacy of apartheid by keeping people on the periphery of cities, far from economic activity. Another input given was that Black people could not simply be put into suburbs. Oh no, because they tried that in America, and it resulted in Black people feeling alienated. I pointed out to this person that unlike America, we are a Black majority country, and that secondly, Black people already feel alienated in townships and informal settlements. So who is to say that their level of alienation wouldn't be reduced if they were closer to economic opportunity? My attempt at trying to argue and debate with this kind of paternalistic thinking was unfortunately futile. At the end of this breakaway session, I was emotionally exhausted, because I think while I was familiar with Steve Biko's maxim of Black man, you are on your own, sitting there that day, I felt it. So when we speak of facilitating action through coalitions for change, who gets to inform the action that is taken? Whose voices matter? And whose voices dominate the coalition? It is my contention that if you are in a room speaking about land or any other policy issue, and the very people whose lives are affected by that policy are not in the room, you must feel uncomfortable. And if you have previously not felt that, I hope that discomfort starts now. We must stay close to communities. And by close, I do not mean merely using communities as a source of data collection, but having them as equal partners in our processes. In the absence of this, we run the risk of theorizing the problems of the poor and commercializing the lives of the disadvantaged and disenfranchised as a means of increasing academic output and advancing our careers. The breadth and depth of our problems in South Africa are too great for us to not want to be better and do better. Unfortunately, good intentions are simply not good enough. Policymakers are also guilty of not keeping close to communities, which often results in defunct policy design. As mentioned, I looked after both early childhood development and land at the foundation. And one of the things I constantly hear from early childhood development practitioners is that the system was not designed for them, poor people from informal settlements. Now, early child development is important because it helps to create the conditions in which the future life prospects of a child isn't hampered by the income poverty of parents. And so in recognition of the importance of early childhood development, the Department of Social Development provides a 15 Rand per child subsidy to registered centers that meet their mean test. Now, in order to become registered, you need to meet the government's norms and standards, which requires a center, for instance, to hand in documentation such as an approved building plan. However, in order to get an approved building plan, one of the things that you need to do is have a title deed. Now, if you are on unproclaimed land, so you are in an area that operates as a township but hasn't been officially declared a township area, you are not able to get a title deed. And so if you're not able to get a title deed, you're not able to get your building plans approved, a health permit, and the other necessary documentation, which means that you cannot receive the subsidy to get registered and then get the subsidy. So no title deed, therefore means no registration, which therefore means no subsidy. So while the Children's Act says that funding to partial care facilities must be prioritized in communities where families lack the means of providing proper shelter, food, and other basic necessities of life to their children, in practice, these communities cannot access this funding. So we must ask ourselves, how did we get to the point where we design a subsidy for the poor, but on account of being poor, you cannot access that subsidy? Now, dealing with land-related issues can be very deflating, but we must not think that our challenges are unique. If I had told you that a member of parliament had said that land reform to date has tinkered at the margins for too long, one would have thought that this was said by a member of our parliament, but it was actually said by a member of the Scottish Parliament speaking about Scotland. Now, in Scotland, they set up in 2017 a Scottish Land Commission that was set up with the aim of reviewing the effectiveness and the impact of Scottish laws and policies relating to land, and to make recommendations to Scottish ministers about what future land reform policies they should have. So not too different from the high-level panel that we had. Now, the Scottish Land Commission found that major landowners were behaving like monopolies across large areas of rural Scotland. And the Competition and Markets Authority, which is their body for investigating monopolies in the UK, found that landowners even met the test for monopoly power. Now, some of the recommendations that this commission came to the conclusion to was that there should be legal powers to subject large land sales to public interest tests. They also made a recommendation that for owners who have large estates, they must have management plans that involve local communities. Another recommendation was that in cases where it is suspected that landowners are abusing their power, there must be powers to investigate these landowners, and there should also be powers that enforce compulsory purchase and community buyouts. The recommendations of this commission show that who owns the land is not secondary to the question of what the land is used for. And some of the questions that this case study should leave us with is, what public interest tests do we have? What kind of management plans do we require when land holdings exceed a certain scale? What kind of community involvement is dictated in law? What review process do we have when landowners are suspected of abusing their powers? And very importantly, for our context, how do we engage with these questions and other pressing questions without being fixated with having the most ideal policy approach. In other words, how do we not let perfect be the enemy of the good and the enemy of progress? And these are some of the questions that I want to leave you with today. Now, my dad, in preparation for the speech, he told me that a good speech is one that tells the audience at the beginning what you were going to say, and at the end sells something. Now, I don't have anything to sell you, but my hope is that going forward, that when we think about the notion of urban citizenship, that we are a lot more reflective about the who, and that we always foreground the needs of communities in whatever activities that we plan, and not the needs that we think are there, but the needs that are actually there. And while I may not be a philosopher, I do think that Madiba would agree with me that as one gets older in South Africa and becomes more familiar with the kind of socioeconomic and spatial legacies that our people have to live in, that it ought to make someone more committed to having fundamental change. And it should spur them to have even more passion and commitment. So I'd like to thank again the Isandla Institute for opening up this space to me. And I hope you are all able to use this opportunity to have a renewed sense of commitment and passion to the sector. Thank you so much.